So Abba, we just thank you so much for your goodness, your faithfulness. Lord, it is good to be in your presence. It is good to be in the place where you want to manifest who you are in the midst of your people. Lord, I just thank you for Shabbat. Thank you for this day that you've made for us to rest, for us to come before you and worship you, for us to recognize your kingship, your lordship over all creation. So, Lord, we just ask that you would facilitate this Torah study this morning. Lead us and teach us. Show us who you are through the scriptures. Help us to follow along the storyline in this passage. So be with us in Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Cool. So as I said, I wasn't able to see the whole video. I started it like I was halfway through, but I didn't get to hear all the interactions that you had. So could you guys maybe just help me fill me in a little bit? Like, what were some highlights from last week? Because I think there's some things that we want to take from last week and carry them over to this week's portion. What kind of stood out from y'all's conversations last week?
Teacher?
You guys are the students. What stood out to you? I can reteach the whole thing. But I don't think you want that.
We discussed characters.
Characters.
Or people's characters.
Okay.
You know, and what constitutes birthright over basically God's blessing and God's decision on that. You know, my whole thing was he's not going to be put in a box just because this child was born first. He's looking at their character. He's looking at their who's gonna move forward his plans and purposes.
Mm-hmm. That's an important theme. Mm-hmm. You actually see that all the way from the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really good. Any other thoughts?
Emma and I disagree on whether or not her losing her kids was her curse or not. I mean, it might have not actually been a God-given curse, but I know I certainly would beat myself up over it.
Okay. I could see, I could see that. The contrast between choice and also like the generational transfer type of thing, the curse transferring from one generation.
Well, she said that she would take his curse
if
he stole the birthright.
Oh, that's right.
So I mean, if nothing else, it's a self-inflicted curse.
It
Except
is,
there's
but
not a
at the
curse.
same time,
I know, it's not an actual, I curse you.
There's more.
You know, it's actually interesting that you mentioned that. There's no mention of Rebecca, right? There's no mention of Rebecca since then. So one has to ask, if it's a narrative explanation, what really happened to her? Was there, because she actually took the effect of whatever the deception that they both played on. She said, I will take the blame for it. So it's interesting that you actually don't hear of her since then.
Yeah,
in the
because
whole
I do understand what Emma's saying. It was not a curse.
Right.
I do get that. But I mean, if nothing else, I know myself, I would be self-inflicting punishment.
Right.
Because of the choices I made that separated me.
Right.
Because we discussed a little bit of difference between, started but didn't really get into the difference between consequence and punishment.
Yeah, it's really interesting because even Torah gives this idea of the husband being able to nullify vows. So it's that a vow that she made that Isaac could have broken. But then you also see the brokenness in their parenting, their even the way that we'll actually get into it, because I want to ask the question, was Isaac is there something that Isaac played in terms of the narrative? Was there a complacency within Isaac towards the covenant move of God? Right, like he was, when you look at the Abraham-Isaac conversation in Genesis 22, and he laid his life on his own accord, right? Like you see that faith even in Isaac, which is really strong towards, like, you can tell, like, but you can read between the lines that he knew and he trusted God would raise him up, right? So what happened to this, like, man of faith, and especially when God had said to Rebecca that the two nations narrative, right? When she was pregnant, the two babies were fighting in her womb. There was a promise that God made to her, which I think, Isaac loved Rebecca. The text is very clear about that. She definitely loved Isaac, right? She fell off the camel, right? So I wouldn't think that they never really talked about what God said to her. Of course they would, right? But what happened over the years, like 40 years into this whole thing, like did Rebecca like continue to communicate God's promise to Jacob, and like this sense of Jacob stayed within the camps, like he stayed indoors, like he was the beloved of Rebecca, and Esau was the beloved of Isaac. Like he worked the fields. He made sure that that he worked hard for the family. So there is a dynamic within the family that is sort of good and something that is also broken. You guys put a little bit of thought into that? I don't know, from last week or.
Do you think the Bible, and maybe in this case in particular, that the issue of senility is ignored or not dealt with?
Say more.
Well, if she did not communicate with him as she had, then maybe it's because it was an exercise in futility. If he was that bad, nothing is said. It's not an issue that's dealt with, as far as I know.
Right.
Because I think he looked at the fact that, Isaac was able to be deceived by Jacob, even though he asked several times, are you really Esau?
Yeah.
And so probably because we have seen dementia, senility, that was one of the things he thought, well, was he able to be deceived by his son because not only was his sight bad, but maybe his mind wasn't strong? I mean, that was a question that Stan wondered, how could you,
that's pretty
if he's
interesting.
older in age, I mean, we don't know. The text doesn't say anything. That was just something that.
Yeah, and we're kind of talking about too, like, did Jacob truly deceive Esau? And like, could there have been another dynamic? And kind of like what we're bringing up is, was Isaac like this passive aggressive figure, and maybe that's why there isn't a ton about him in Scripture, because he wasn't, I don't know, say as involved in the promises or as aggressive in maybe what the Lord was revealing to him, because his parents had him at such a late age. I mean,
right.
There's a lot of dynamics, but so maybe he in the flesh had a favorite of Esau, and even though Jacob, because they had to have had that conversation, and so maybe he was disobedient, obstinate, and he was going to pass it along to his favorite son as opposed to what God had spoken. Which brings up
a good conversation, which segues to where we want to start this week. Go ahead.
Well,
Let me hear your thought, then we'll go there.
Also, because we're doing a lot of supposition here.
Yeah.
Yes.
True.
There's also the other aspect that he knew that there was going to be this switch because of the prophecies that came to Rebecca. Is it possible that he was fishing for Jacob to have an opportunity to be honest and to to come, what's the word, come clean with what he was doing. We don't know, because we don't know motives and attitudes, only the Lord knows motives and attitudes, but there's also that other aspect. He was told not to leave the land. He was the one that had to possess the land and stay there. Maybe he was wiser than we're giving him credit for, and he was looking for, what are you really gonna do here, Jacob, and what's your character, and but also knowing that Esau's character was the way it was, how can he actually be have the firstborn blessing, that's supposed to, all the inheritance is supposed to go to the guy that's the most responsible and stays by the stuff.
Right.
Usually that's the firstborn. In this case, it was the secondborn.
Right.
So. And he did hold the heel of his brother when he came out, so
Yes, because, I mean, let's not discredit Isaac either. Like, I don't think he was a slouch either. I think, this is where I've landed, is I think he knew, especially being, compared to Ishmael, right? Like, he's a secondborn who actually became the inheritor of the promise of God. This would be so intimate to him, and the word of promise to Rebecca when she was pregnant, I think he was cognizant of it. I think in the flesh, I think he really enjoyed, I think he showed love and expressed his love to Esau more than he did to Jacob, because he provided him with a game, like he tilled the land and he worked hard for the family. But apart from that, though, when it came to the promise of the covenant, I think Isaac was actually aware, right? Because we'll see two blessings, right, that Isaac pronounced over Jacob. The first one is the blessing of the firstborn, which was the stolen birthright, if you will. And this was the promise that was to be for the firstborn. Like, let's look at it just real quickly, because I think that will set us up for chapter 27, 28. May God give you from the dew of the sky and from the fatness of the land an abundance of grain and new wine. So we're talking about, just wealth. May peoples serve you, and may nations bow down to you. Be master of your brother. I mean, look at the narrative of Jacob's life. This really does not come into fruition. Like, matter of fact, the opposite is true. He has to work extremely hard for the blessing that God actually gives him via Laban. He has to humble himself before Esau, and he actually has to bow down to Esau. He even calls him Lord, right? Like, so we see a different posture in terms of the blessing, right? So we have to ask the question, is God really interested about the firstborn blessing, or is God's economy a little bit different? There's another blessing that he wanted to pronounce, and Isaac was actually committed to pronounce that blessing. The way it came about was via Jacob's exile, right? He was instructed by his mom to go find a wife from her brother's home. Let's just finish this up real quick. May people serve you, and may nations bow down to you. Be master over your brother. May your mother's sons bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. Now, there are hints of the Abrahamic covenant, like in here, right? You see hints of it, but you go to chapter 28, verse 3. Now, this is right before he leaves. Isaac pronounces this blessing over him. He says, may El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you so that you become an assembly of people. So, once again, fruitful, multiply you. You have that seed there. May you become an assembly. That's the word kahal, for the first time used as a sense of blessing. This is the assembly. This is where we get our New Covenant scripture where it talks about ecclesia, church. That's the same word, root word. So it appears here as a sense of promise. Later on, when Jacob meets Esau, we'll see that word again, but it's not the fullness of it. Actually, Israel becomes an ecclesia at Mount Sinai. but the word is actually hinted at least, right there. It appears for the first time, so we want to pay attention to the words that appear for the first time. And may he give you the blessing of Abraham. So this is what we're talking about, the continuity of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, Isaac gives that to Jacob. So this is an affirmation that whatever was promised to Abraham was going to go and be passed on to Jacob. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the contrast between these two blessings, I think is healthy to look at them in a healthy dynamic here. Meaning, God's promise, you all have been saying it, doesn't have to come through the firstborn blessing. That's all we're trying to say. And then it says, to you and to your seed, that you may take possession of the land of your sojourn, which God gave to Abraham. And then, of course, we got the Bethel narrative, which is part of our Torah portion today. So, from Isaac's blessing, he comes out. He's now going to Padan Aram, and the Lord actually appears to him, right? So let's look at verse 10 through 22 of chapter 28, and let's kind of make some observations, because this is a really important passage. Then Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. He happened upon a certain place, Makom. Now that word place seems to appear between verse 10 and I believe the next page in verse 17. It appears 5 times. So he's talking about a specific place, certain place, and spent the night there, for the sun had set. So he took one of the stones from the place and put it in his head and lay down in that place. He dreamed all of a sudden there was a stairway set up on the earth, and its top reached to the heavens. And behold, angels of God going up and down it. Surprisingly, Adonai was standing on top of it, and he said, I am Adonai, the God of your father Abraham, God of Isaac. Let's pause there. So what are a few observations there? When you think of a stairway, what do you think? What do you think of?
Connection.
Okay.
Both up
Okay.
and down.
Okay. Connection to
2 levels.
2 levels. Okay. Safe to say heaven and earth. Okay.
So it would be like the third heaven and then the first. I mean, we're
So in the English word, stairway doesn't fully communicate, but in their ancient understanding of a stairwell, they're probably thinking of a ziggurat, right? So you're talking about a pathway, a gateway where, heaven touches earth, and there's the deity at the top of the ziggurat, and the ziggurat has this stone pathway, which sometimes could be in a circle, sometimes could be in a, I think the TLV has a really interesting picture. I actually love that picture. If you guys have it, I don't know. Can you see this? It's really cool, actually.
It is cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, awesome.
So what the ancients would have understood this.
Looks like a DNA chain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. So the ancients would have understood this in terms of a ziggurat. Like, this is where the deity that they worship would be on the top, and then of course they would offer the sacrifices and stuff at the end. Their narrative is different. Adonai is different. Okay, and yet God is introducing himself, right? Like, now he's got the blessing from Isaac, but now God is reiterating, and he's saying, like he's introducing himself to him. But it's not only that, but what does he see? He also sees, behold, the angels of God are coming up and down on the stairway, right? Like, he's not only seeing a deity at the top, or he's not just seeing Adonai at the top, he's also seeing angels, activity, and it's not specifically to that location where he just slept. We were talking about the gateway where God and man comes. So this is, I'm thinking the Garden of Eden. I'm thinking this is the place where God wants to manifest himself. Like, and he says, I will give it to you, this land which you lie upon. I'll give it to you and to your seed. Your seed will be as the dust of the land, and you'll burst forth to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in it, all the families of the earth will be blessed, and in your seed. So now we're seeing a continuity of the Abrahamic covenant, but it's not only pronounced to him by Isaac, but it's actually by God. God makes sure that he communicates, that he entered, like he reiterates that covenant with Jacob here. There's no question about, like, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Like, there's no question. It's God who's saying it. And then of course he let's pause there. Thoughts, interactions.
I'm realizing that God himself is reiterating the covenants generation to generation. And it's almost like, as believers, each generation has to receive or reject and have personal encounter with the Lord. So I can't go on the faith of my parents, which actually at the time I was growing up, they weren't believers.
Right.
But there were generations before who were.
Yeah.
And as I've been walking with the Lord, I realized our children had to make their own decision. They had to have their own encounter with God. Every person has to have their own encounter with God. And I wonder if there is kind of a parallel there,
Yeah.
that it solidifies when you have that personal encounter.
Yeah.
You're not just going on someone else's word, but you're getting the word where you really, really need it, which is from God Most High himself.
Yes, that's really good. It's a good observation. Absolutely true. Yeah.
I heard somebody say something, and I'm paraphrasing, like, when you have an angelic encounter like this, it's God basically building your faith or giving you vision for the future, because likely you're getting ready to be tested. And so the blessing's going to get tested, and so
Yeah.
you've got to have this vision. So hypothetically, if this didn't happen, maybe Jacob wouldn't have been able to endure
Right.
the 20 years with Laban.
Right. That's true.
interesting-
And also notice, that's a great observation, because that made me think of, notice that our Torah portion this week, it opens up with an angelic activity happening in that place, that makom, right? The word place is repeated 5 times, so they're very intentional when that happens, right? So think of it like, all right, let's go back. What happens, right? Like, Adam falls asleep and God makes woman out of Adam, right? Like, God puts Abraham asleep and cuts a covenant with him in Genesis 15. Like, you see this pattern, like God works through patterns, and same thing, like he wants to take out anything within Jacob that could potentially pollute, or there's no question about what God is trying to communicate. So right now, Jacob is completely out of himself because he's sleeping, right? There's nothing that he could think or conjure on his own to pollute what God is trying to communicate. There's one, that. So back to what Lori, you were saying, yes, God wants that intimate relationship. And then 2, it's also, you see this whole narrative, this whole exile narrative, if you will, like where Jacob goes to Haran, in this 20-year in the wilderness narrative for Jacob, where it's sandwiched between 2 angelic activities, right? Once when he leaves the promised land, Canaan, and once when he comes back. So did you catch that? I don't know. Because right at the beginning of chapter 32, Jacob left and on his way, the angels of God met him. So we're talking about multiple angels. And Jacob said when he saw them, this is God's camp, and he named the place Mahanaim. I can't pronounce it. Now I don't know if it's the exact place, Bethel, but it's definitely 10 days travel time from where Laban was. So we're talking about really close to where he was supposed to go, to Bethel. And so we're talking about this place that God is speaking of. This is the place where even Jacob says, this is the house of God. And angels are protecting it. Remember, like in the Garden of Eden, Adam gets kicked out of the garden, and the cherubs are protecting the Garden of Eden so that they wouldn't come back and eat of the tree of life. So we're talking about angelic activity in this place where God says this is the place of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So God has his eyes on this place, and Moses is, or whoever's writing it, is making sure that we're tracking along the narrative that God has this place back to the garden. This idea of coming back to where God becomes Adonai, the only God that is worshipped in his land and the people that he loves. So this continuous narrative line that sort of, you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so
Did Noah have one of those visitations? I'm just trying to think without going back and looking. Well, he did get the encounter of there is gonna be a flood, so build an ark.
right, I
And
know
there was
he
an
interacted. I
exile.
don't know if it, what kind of, I don't know.
Encounter it
What do
was.
you guys think? I don't remember if there was an actual visitation. I know Adonai spoke to him,
Spoke to
but
him.
but this is like specific.
Oh, okay, with
like,
the angelic activity in the lake.
activity and the reiteration of the covenant. It's like super significant.
But they were exiled on the boat for
Mm-hmm.
almost a year.
Mm-hmm. The patterns do continue.
Pattern is there.
Yeah, the pattern is there for sure. Yeah,
Huh.
yeah, a new light coming out of chaos,
Right,
and
right.
yeah, all of that.
I don't think it ever says that God used a dream to communicate with Noah.
Hmm.
No, doesn't say.
Yeah,
I don't think it says.
yeah. All right. So now, can we go back to the text just so that we can use our time? Verse 15, it says, now behold, I am with you, and I will watch over you, and wherever you go, I will bring you back to this land, for I will not forsake you until I have done what I have promised you. So not only God communicates or reiterates the covenant to him, but he also makes a promise that he would be with him, that he would bring him back to the land. So we also see this continuous pattern where God is with him, like God is with him. You'll notice that same theme, I don't know if you guys got to touch up on this, even with Isaac, right? When Abraham, in the choosing of Isaac's wife, Rebecca, like the servant goes, but it seems like all of a sudden he meets Rebecca. Like, how is that a coincidence, or was that God with him? So in the narrative, you'll notice that God being with him is going to be this thing that sticks out and gives him the strength, like you were saying, for the next 20 years of being in the wilderness and character formation and dying to self and all of that stuff that he goes through, right? Even in the choosing of his wife, he's going to have this context of God with me. In the context of Laban having to make him work 6 years, and the whole narrative with the sheep, and like, God is with you. I'm the one that's going to make you prosper. So chapter 28 is going to be very fundamental for Jacob when we look at his wilderness experience, if you will. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Are there
28, when Jacob makes his vow,
Mhm.
is the wording just, you know, kind of, if God be with me?
Uh-huh.
It doesn't exactly mean that, does it? I mean, if God be with me, then Adonai will be my God.
Right.
I mean, I guess it is, but yet it sounds kind of pretentious in a way.
Does it really translate to a challenge?
It is.
Okay.
In one sense, because the question in the ancient times, it's like, does God exist was never anybody's ideal back then. They didn't think in terms of like, is there a God? Like, we deal with that in our, you know, in the 21st century, we ask the question, is God there? The question was, which God do we worship?
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, among all the gods, and that's why the ziggurat imagery is important, is because this is the God. Adonai is the one who's introducing himself, and he's saying, I am the God of your father Isaac, Abraham, Isaac. I am that God.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an introduction to the God who he's called to serve and worship. So, I mean, in some sense, is it possible that, you know, Isaac and Rebecca and the family, did they continue to worship Adonai? Did they continue to offer sacrifice to Adonai? It's hidden in the text, right? You want to say a few words on that?
Well, I wondered that on the fact that, I mean, obviously when he had this encounter, it's like he was fearful.
Yeah.
He knew this. But the fact that, I have wondered, like, to what extent did Isaac and Rebecca teach
Mhm.
about the God of Abraham to their kids, both their kids, because it kind of seems like Esau didn't follow any of that,
Mhm.
in a sense, you know, from
Yeah.
examples. And then you're kind of going, not only did Jacob have to have this encounter, because I feel like he had to have that encounter with the Lord. It wasn't like he was going out there, I'm on a mission from God.
Yeah.
He was, in a sense, going to get a wife and fleeing from his brother.
Right.
He wasn't, you know, so
Mm.
there's been thoughts in my, like, later we're told, you know, teach your children,
Mhm.
because it kind of seems like generationally,
Yeah.
this hasn't been real good. And maybe they were good parents and they taught it and their kids just weren't listening, didn't
Mhm.
believe it, you know, I don't know. But, I mean, how old is he here? Like, isn't he close to 40?
Are you talking about Jacob?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely past 40.
Yeah, so it seems to me like he
Except
doesn't have
40
this.
years is when Esau
Yeah.
married the Hittites, which
Yeah.
were Canaanites.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
It just doesn't
Sons of
seem like
Ham.
he had this firm established relationship with the Lord yet.
yeah. Go ahead, Stan.
I kind of agree with you, the bargaining, that
Yeah.
if you do this and this, like, hey, $50 in a pair of Pumas and I'm your boy.
Well, that's very
That's
true.
kind of crass, you know?
Actually,
But think of it also as a demand for covenant loyalty.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
That's right.
like,
Like Jacob's doing the demand?
Jacob, yeah,
Okay.
because, like, covenant loyalty demands that God is also loyal to me, right?
Right.
So it's a both and. But God he knows where he's at. Like, and he doesn't also, you know, expect from Jacob something that he hasn't actually fully experienced. And it's gonna take him lifelong to sort of get into that. And he remembers this words, like when God later on says, okay, go, but now is the time to go back. You see the faith rising in him, like, oh, God has been with me. You'll see it in the narrative, like when he gives that speech to both his wives. Where was it? Yeah, here it is. It's chapter 31, and I'm at the verse 9 right now. He says, like, so God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. So he's communicating. I mean, that whole, like, if you look from verse 6 all the way to 11 or 12 there, you'll notice in his speech to his wives like he has this faith, you know, God has been with us, like I have amassed this wealth because God has made it possible. Like that's the kind of narrative you see. So, you know, God's faithfulness to him is also a basis of faith for Jacob, right? Like it's an encounter, it's an invitation. You know, when you'll see that in Exodus 2, right? Like when God introduces himself to them at Sinai, they didn't have full loyalty and allegiance, like, but there was that invitation to be the people of God. So.
Well, God's faithfulness to us
Yeah.
causes us to grow in our faith. I mean, it's the
Right.
same.
Exactly.
If God was never faithful to us, we probably would look elsewhere,
That-
in a way.
Exactly, and that's why we need to present a gospel that shows God's covenant faithfulness, the gospel that we believe. So, like, the faith comes from this story that has been told, and we've actually believed it.
Yeah.
That his covenant loyalty from beginning to the end. So.
And he has been.
And he has been, exactly. And it's that faith that actually allows us to, like, through the Holy Spirit working in our heart, then we say yes to him, and so that's the born again experience in some sense, you know,
Yeah.
is where we finally give allegiance to him.
And all three of them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't have like a community. They didn't have faith community. They had their relationship with God. That was it. And, you know, like, by the time Jacob has 12 sons, I mean, now we're talking community and people who can bounce off of each other. But we kind of even mentioned last week that Isaac was really separated. I mean, he never was allowed to go back and see family. He couldn't leave the land.
Yep.
It's, you know, Abraham and God, Isaac and God, Jacob and God. I
Yep.
mean, they didn't have
That's good.
that community, they had God. And so I think that's why these encounters with the Lord is even more important, because here we have community. Like if you're struggling, you have somebody in community that can speak into your life. The
Yeah.
only thing that these men had
Yeah.
was if they had an encounter with the Lord.
Yeah. And even if they had a tiny bit of a community within the family, there was dysfunction.
Right.
His life was at
Yeah.
stake.
Yeah.
And not to mention, like, we should have said this earlier, but Rebecca and Isaac actually missed the timing of Isaac's passing. Like, he lived until he was 180. Like, the timing of even pronouncing the blessing, like, they didn't see it correctly either. Like, so there was a lot of dysfunction in terms of timing, in terms of communicating this covenant way of bringing up, like, because Abraham didn't allow Isaac to go to, he sent the servant, right, to bring the wife here.
And God didn't let him go either when there was a famine.
Exactly.
You're not allowed to leave.
Exactly. So there's a lot of, like, in ideals in Jacob's situation, although the Lord uses the in ideals of his exile, of his time in the wilderness to shape his character, and even builds his family. Like, I don't think it was God's ideal. God wanted him to stay in the land. I won't weigh in too much on that.
I'm seeing there's this, Melissa, did you wanna go? There's this interesting thought that I've always wondered about. What is the deal that we know how to raise our children, although you repeat parental guidelines, and until someone comes in and shows you there's a better way to parent, you don't know. You just do whatever you were raised with. They didn't have the 10 words. They didn't have the, treat your neighbor as yourself. They didn't have any of that back until Moses came along. So the fact that God was willing to work with the dysfunction of the way human beings were treating each other says a lot about his patience. And the whole idea of the covenant, this is another topic, but the whole idea of the covenant, I never saw my conversion, when I came back to the Lord, as a covenantal thing, because I made a bargain with God. I didn't realize that's what I was doing, because I didn't even believe in God at that point. But I said, if you exist, I need proof. If you'll prove it to me, I'm 100% in. 6 months later, I got that proof, and I've had proof every day for the last 51 years. But I've never wavered in my devotion and commitment to him. I had one time where I actually said, what is the point of following you? Things are disaster around me, and I'm like, this is a mess, and I don't get it. And I actually asked God, I said, why am I following you? What is the point? Is this really worth it? And he showed me where I would be if I wasn't following him, and it was my tombstone. It was my grave. And ever since that point, and I had been following him about 5 years at that point, and after that, it's like never been an issue for me. But I never looked at it as a covenant thing that God was doing in my own heart. And that concept didn't hit until just now. He has a covenant, but it's if. I just never saw it that way before. That if statement that Jacob did.
That was his baseline. That's
where
he was.
The baseline is the if.
Yeah, it's not the ideal, but that's where he was.
Because, kind of along with that, what we're seeing throughout all of the Torah, but even just in Genesis up to this point, is this progressive revelation of what it means to walk with God. Even the comparison back to Noah, yes, God spoke to Noah, but it was in a much different way than God is speaking to Jacob. Already there's been this progression of how God interacts, and they're still learning, and it's taking a very long time. It's taking many generations, but learning how to walk with God. And this is, we brought very briefly last week, talked about Rebecca, yes, there was deception, and we're not saying that was necessarily the right thing to do, but when we're looking at this, the wrestle is that she had received this word, she'd heard the Lord, when she was pregnant, and then we have this whole thing, which we've talked through the whole selling the birthright for the bowl of soup situation, and that seems legit. There's not really any blatant deception in that. It's Jacob kind of being an opportunist, but it's not, but that's it's kind of legal. That's not really, there's nothing wrong with that really, but then there becomes an issue if the blessing doesn't go along with the birthright. And Rebecca knows that. And so in some sense, she knows what God has said, and she's doing what she can to make sure that happens. And because that's all she knows to do at that point. They don't have the same kind of presence of God dwelling among them as we see later on. It's not until, Sinai and Exodus that we see that we have this actual God dwelling among the people. And so it's just this very long progression of what it means to follow God. And so that's why we have, I think part of why we have some of these records of like Jacob kind of bargaining of I've heard of who you are. He's probably heard the story of Abraham with, the covenant being made with Abraham, and even the 3 messengers coming in Sodom and Gomorrah and all these things, and with Isaac, he probably knows some of these stories. But he's but if you're really God, how do you show up for me? And of course, this is also coming off the tail of that whole really kind of messy situation. Is God still going to be with me, even though this, the way that this blessing passed to me wasn't completely honest, So it's this reaffirmation that God's promise doesn't change, which again goes back to God doesn't tend to change what he said. God is faithful. He does what he says, even back from even when people mess up and make the situation just really seemingly unnecessarily messy. This is still the line that he's chosen. He's not oh, you pretended to be your brother, so now I'm going to pick someone else. That's not what God does. Which even, then carries forward all the way into replacement theology. God doesn't give up on Israel because of Israel's disobedience. It's God is very consistent to be faithful to who he chooses, even when it's at this point still one person. And of course, we're about to kind of see the expansion of the family and the people. But I just think kind of seeing that process of building relationship and what does it mean to
Progressive
be.
revelation.
Yeah.
Huge to remember.
So good.
Huge. Who was it? I think it's either Jonathan Sachs or John Selhamer. He mentions that because the birthright was being stolen, or not stolen, but negotiated by the bowl of lentils, literally, he puts the blame back on Esau when Isaac was going to bless Esau, Esau should have stepped up and said, I actually lost that.
Yeah.
He doesn't, I mean, it's interesting. I've never looked at it that way.
Interesting perspective.
That he's not saying, either whoever it was that said it, they're not saying that what Jacob and Rebekah did was right. They're basically saying, no, actually the right thing could have also been for Esau to say, no, I've actually lost that place.
I gave it away.
I gave it away, I squandered it, yeah.
Yeah, because for him to rightfully receive the blessing, he would have had to almost go back and undo that transaction with Jacob.
With Jacob,
Right,
exactly.
yeah, right.
He's gotta somehow get that back from
Yeah.
Jacob, yeah.
Mhm.
So let's now, let's not go line by line. Let's just say the whole of chapter 29. Let's kind of frame it in the sense of, Jacob's love for Rachel and less love, I guess, for Leah, and we can interact on that. On this, I found really helpful. Jonathan Sachs made a comment that I thought was really interesting. Talking about the Lord opening Leah's womb, but closed the womb of Rachel, right? And the text is clear that the Lord did, in the text is pretty clear, right? In this whole narrative. And then he says this, and we can interact on it. Nowhere in Genesis do we read that Abraham loved Sarah. Once we hear that Isaac loved Rebekah. 3 times we read that Jacob loved Rachel, and 3 times that he loved Joseph. The Hebrew Bible is a book of love. Love God with all your heart, soul, and might. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the stranger. But love is not unproblematic, given to one but not the other. To one more than the other, it creates tension that can turn into violence. More than any character in Genesis, Jacob loves, but the result is conflict between Leah and Rachel, and between Joseph and the brothers. And so he says the message of Genesis is that love is necessary but not sufficient. You also need to be sensitive to how people feel loved and unloved. So I thought that was a great statement. So based off of what he said, and looking at the entire chapter 29, what are some observations as the narrative continues?
The song is wrong.
What's that?
The song is wrong. You don't. All you need is love.
Oh, that's funny.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't this speaking to how the Lord eventually makes the law one man and one woman versus multiple wives because of the conflict that it's showing here that it causes, that it's, can you truly love 2 people at the same time?
Yeah.
Or at least the Torah portion says, the law says, don't marry sisters.
Right.
Yeah, but you've got the deception thing in here by the dad
Well,
and what
yes.
he did. So,
Isn't it interesting that what he did, the same deception, sort of like
Came
ended up
back
on
on
him?
him.
Yeah, well, goes around, comes around,
True.
be sure your sins will find you out, I think is.
Yeah, but Laban's, although it was a deception, there was something about, is it right for the younger to get married before the older? I don't know, there's something in the text there. Let's interact on that, right? Did you guys notice how Jacob actually flung that big rock at the well? Did you guys
Yes.
notice that?
No.
It was like flexing.
He
It took-
waited for her to show up, but.
That's true. I mean, it's in the text there.
Uh-huh.
Because they were waiting for all the guys to come and
Yeah.
all the flock to come, and then when he saw her, he was like, "I'm gonna show off."
Now
And
it's
he just
time.
pulled
Yeah.
In the text, it says like it was a big stone. That's a side note.
I never noticed that before. That's hilarious.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. You didn't even wait for the other guys to roll this.
Well, so along the Leah, Rachel lines, you know, what was it, how are we translating? Leah had dimness of eyes, I believe, versus Rachel was
Yeah.
basically beautiful or attractive.
It's so I think it's contrasting in terms of it's because beauty, right, in the eye of the beholder. So Jacob was more attracted to Rachel. I think that's what the text is trying to say.
Right.
I don't think the text is weighing in whether, you know, Leah was an unattractive woman. I think the text is basically saying actually Jacob was more attracted to Rachel. And that's how I understand it. If you guys have a different perspective.
I think it was more specific.
Really?
It says, because she had bad eyes. And maybe that was a delicate way of saying she had a lazy eye.
We talk about cross
Yeah.
eyes.
Yes.
We don't know. Something in her eyes. you know?
He delicately wrote about that.
Some about
Weak
those
eyes or
eyes.
delicate eyes. That's funny.
So is it possible also being like the girl next door versus the prom queen? In the long run, the girl next door in most movies is usually better off than the prom queen. Cause I mean, Rachel being the prom queen, she got her room closed and Leia got all the kids. So the girl next door movies tends to be the one that benefits the most, even though you're not
Yeah.
yet gonna be beautiful.
Right.
She's loved for her merits.
Right.
But
Generally more industrious.
how does the Lord respond to this whole situation, right? Because
Again, it's
you're naturally inclined. No, wait a second. Jacob really liked her. Like, why doesn't God allow him? You know,
Won't God looking at
like
character?
from a distorted lens, right? Like you could kind of weigh in on the text and say, but that's not how the Lord treats this situation. Even though there was deception, the Lord still blessed and opened Leah's womb.
I mean, is she the one? No, I don't know how to say it. Never mind.
Are you going for even the line of the promise?
The line of the promise, and just again, he's looking at it's what's on the inside that counts. So, was she? If it's a possibility that weak in her eyes, if she couldn't see very well, if you're looking at it that way and not attractiveness, would she have been home doing more of the home mama work as opposed to out in the fields with the sheep? Was she doing more in home?
Interesting.
That would be the learning and the Bible and that type of stuff.
That's an interesting observation.
Homeschooling mama like your wife who does all of this versus a mama who's not involved, goes, I'm not saying that working is bad, but goes to work every day and drops your kid off at the daycare for 11 hours a day and picks them up.
Right.
Who has more impact, who's gonna have more impact on their kids' life in the long run.
So interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking of Yeshua now. You know, Isaiah 53 saying he had no form or comeliness. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of many sorrows and griefs. So could that tie into Leah having Judah in the line down to Yeshua? What is it about God that he chooses the despised or weak things of the world in men's eyes, and yet he highly esteems them?
Yeah.
I just really like verse 31 where it says, now Adonai saw that Leah was in love, so he opened her womb.
Yeah.
it just shows compassion.
Yeah.
I mean, in the reality of like her bridal week, her husband's with her, but he's not her he wants to be with. I mean, there's just so many. So the great compassion of the Lord on her in her situation, that it kind of just shows that you're not unseen. You know, I mean, Jacob's the theme of the story in a sense,
Yeah.
but his wives, they mattered to the
Yeah.
Lord.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when there is this insignificance, I mean, I know Lot was the worth, they felt like their worth was through giving children what a woman's worth looked like then.
Mhm.
And just the fact that the Lord had compassion on her and was showing her, you're worth a lot,
Mhm.
even if your husband's not showing this to you.
Mhm.
I just see this level of compassion in there.
Yeah. I like that. It's really good.
I was also thinking in terms of, didn't Rachel only have Joseph?
At that
And
point,
then
yes,
at that
and then
point,
Benjamin later.
And
Yeah.
she had Benjamin later, and didn't she die shortly after Benjamin was
Giving
born?
birth.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're also dealing with a physical issue here
Mhm.
that God knew because he created them. And
Yeah.
if Rachel had had more children, it's possible she might have died sooner or whatever. I mean, we don't know. Those are suppositions. But I've often wondered if there was a physical thing, we call it shutting the womb, but there could have been a physical reason why Rachel couldn't have more than the one. And yes, it is God that gives the
Yeah.
children. I have no question about that when I've seen miracle births and miracle pregnancies and all that.
Right.
But I thought it was interesting that if he had to have 12, Esau had 12, or not Esau,
It's Jacob.
no, Abraham's,
Ishmael.
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 Ishmael
Yeah,
had 12 sons.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with
Mhm.
foundational things and whatever, but I
Yeah.
don't, that was just my thought, was there, we don't know, but there could have been some physical issues too that God knew about. So I love the whole encompassing, he's compassionate, he's loving, he understands, we're getting all these aspects of the nature of God through this whole story.
Mhm.
And we scratch our head going, wow.
Yeah, I mean, to add to what you guys are saying, the dysfunction that this caused,
Oh, yeah.
right? The dysfunction between two sisters, the dysfunction that eventually begins to happen with brothers, right? Like you have, even to the extent, like, there must have been some way, like even Reuben, like, went and found this mandrake root, right? Like, and he gives it to his mom, and that root is supposed to be quote unquote like an opioid, but it's also like it's supposed to be kind of like a love potion, if you will, which is meant to open the womb. So you can tell in the text, even the children were vying, were kind of vying for their mom, for Leah to have more kids. You'll see that later on in the tension where, with Joseph having the dream and the brothers being against him. So the dysfunction sort of continues within the, this family of 12, and yet the Lord honored not only just the natural children, but also the children that came from the maidservants as well. And so that you have the 12 tribes that God recognizes as the legitimate like tribes of Israel. And this becomes the root family, if you will. And yet out of what we could consider dysfunction, God can make something everlasting, right?
Yeah.
Like even in the age to come, the 12 gates are going to be named again, the names of these 12 tribes. And so the way that the Lord views, I'm just amazed how the Lord is compassionate and kind, and he operates out of a different set of views, if you will. Anything you guys want to comment on that?
So here's Messiah who comes on the scene so many generations later, and I use Matthew, and look, the two gospels that give his lineage, and you see all of the dysfunction in the lineage of Messiah, and yet he was Messiah.
Yeah.
So, does that show his loving kindness, his mercy? His honoring, his redemption, his true to his word. He keeps his side of the covenant even when we break it. It's amazing to me to see who's in the lineage on the human side of Yeshua.
And yet, I don't think we also see this like heart of God that He wants there to be functional families. Like He wants healthy families.
Yeah.
Because
Agreed.
even like
yeah,
because
let's not
like
leave it at the dysfunction.
right, it's like I mean yeah, it's like He's kind and He makes it work and we see how He works so powerfully. But I think even like what I see with one of the things that I see with Rachel and Leah, along with things that the rest of you have all mentioned, but like Leah did not have the love of her husband, but she had the love of her children, but she was unsatisfied with that. Like, because it even says, like after Adonai sees her and gives her these children, but she thinks that Adonai does that so that her husband will love her.
Right.
And that doesn't work out, and so she still has, she's still lacking.
Right.
And then Rachel is the reverse. She has the love of her husband, but she doesn't have these children. And so they're both incomplete.
Yeah.
And so I think like even some of those details point towards like, again, like later on in the Torah when we get some of the instruction, God specifically says, don't try this again. It didn't work out very well.
Yeah.
But like, I think we see like the fullness, like there's like this intention towards the fullness of a husband and wife who love each other and have children.
Yeah.
And have this like more functional family.
Yeah.
Because I think even probably with Reuben, and I mean it kind of alludes to this a little bit, I think too, is like he gets old enough that he sees this dynamic playing out.
Yeah.
And he loves his mother, but he knows that his love for his mother is not enough. Yeah. And so then he plays into this with the mandrakes and all of this. And so it just continues to build because there's something missing. There's this missing aspect of this functional family.
Yeah.
And even going back to this whole Rachel and Leah, I mean, it doesn't really say that there's much difference in their character. We don't know anything about their character. And really, we just see Jacob meeting Rachel first. He may not know that she has an older sister until, and Laban has the opportunity again to be more forthright when Jacob approaches and says, I want to marry your daughter Rachel.
Yeah.
He has the opportunity then to be like, well, because it was definitely custom at the time, the older daughter gets married first.
Sure.
Instead of the deception that plays out. And so there's lots of dysfunction. And yet, of course, this becomes the 12 tribes and this becomes,
Exactly.
the foundational structure of the entire nation of Israel.
Right.
And so there is redemption in it, but it's like there's also a lot of opportunity for things to have been done differently.
Yeah, exactly. You had 7 years
Right.
to get to know the 7 years
And
to get
again,
to know Rachel.
Laban is like the opportunist of all opportunists.
Yep.
And that's like what we saw back with even in the Rebecca story, like what he notices first is the gold, and so he's like, this is gonna be good for me. What can I get out of this?
Yeah.
He seems a bit selfish.
Is it like a family thing with Rebecca and
Right.
you have the two
Right.
brother and sister?
Right. And so it's just, like there's just a lot of these dynamics playing out. But I think like along with this graciousness, sovereignty of God to be able to work through all of this dysfunction and all of these issues, I think I see like the hope that he wants there to be healthy families.
Yeah.
Like he wants to bring restoration unto healthy families.
Yeah.
And hopefully people learn from the dysfunction
Right.
Yes.
and see that having favorites and that kind of thing
Yes.
doesn't work well.
Right.
Hopefully.
And I love the naming of her first 4 sons by Leah, because you kind of see this progression, like the first has to do with God saw, then it has to do with God hearing, and then it has to do with attachment of the joining with Levi. All of those were still with her trying to get her husband's attention, but by the 4th time where Judah, it says, for this reason she named him Judah. It says, this time I praise Adonai. It was not like this because he saw me, because he heard me. Maybe my husband will be attached to me. This time it just says she just praised Adonai. So I think there's just this cool progression
of her relationship with the Lord
Yes.
reflected in the names of her children.
Right.
Yep.
It's really interesting how, it could be hinted in the text, and I'm glad you brought that, because did Jacob really communicate to his family, immediate family, did he introduce Adonai to them? The question is yes. The answer is yes, he did. Because even when the Lord remembered Rachel, it says what she named him Joseph, saying, "May Adonai add another son." So she's attributing and giving thanks to Adonai, that God, and may he give me another son. Like Leah mentions, right? This time I praise Adonai. So you'll notice, yes, there's an introduction, and yet like a little bit of compromise too, right? Because Rachel takes the idol of her dad. So yeah, you see that tension in there as
We
well.
also have that, you and I discussed this before, we have that word remembered. So
Yep.
it's then God remembered Rachel, and I
Yep.
told you when I had read that one thing, it said a lot of times, it's not like God forgot her.
Yes.
But when God remembers, when he remembered Noah and the ark, when he remembers the Israelites and hears their cry, that's his point of breaking in a form of justice now.
Yes.
So he opens her womb. It's
Yes.
like, now it's the time to set this right.
Yeah. It's true. That's true. Okay, I think 9:47, we should probably end it here. Yeah, but I think in chapter 31, I guess, the Lord appears to Jacob, right? Like, verse 3, Adonai said to Jacob, "Return to your land." Now that he's getting that affirmation, the promise from God was that he would continue to be with him, that he would continue to protect him, and that he would return him to the land. And so now the Lord has said, okay, it's time to go back to your land. And as I said earlier on, he was met by the angels of God, right, as he entered into the land. In this narrative, when he's like talking to Leah and Rachel, I think it's an important one. Let me just read it.
Verse?
Verse 4. Okay, so Jacob sent and called to Rachel and Leah, "Come to the field." And he said to them, "I can see by your father's face that the expression isn't the same. It is as it was just 2 days ago, but the God of my father has been with me." Remember that theme? I will be with you. He's saying he has been with me. Now yourselves know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has fooled around with me and has changed my salary 10 times, but God hasn't allowed him to harm me. So he will protect me, right? I will protect you. And now he's seeing that God has protected me. If you would say the spotted ones, it kind of tells the narrative there, verse 9. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. So he's attributing the wealth that he got from, not from Laban or from his work or service, he's attributing it to God blessing him. So he's connecting everything that he's saying to the blessing that he received from God, the word and that promise that God would be with him, that he would protect him, that he would bring him back to the land. He's connecting all of these things to him, right? So that encounter reminds him of that again. Now it's happened when the flock were in heat, verse 11, then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, Hineni, he said, lift up your eyes and see what the males going to the flock, stripes to the spotted and speckled, for I have seen everything Laban has done to you. I am the God of Bethel. He reminds him who he is, where you anointed a memorial stone, where you made a vow to me. So what was the vow? If you will provide for me, if you will protect me, I will what?
Return to my father's house.
I will return to my father's house. And he said, you will be my God, right? So now he's like, the Lord is saying, I've done all these things, and he, by his own testimony, he's attributing his life to how this God that introduced himself at Bethel has been with him, has been protecting him, and is now calling him back to the land. And now he's saying, he is my God. You made a vow to me. The Lord is reminding him, okay, remember, I introduced myself to you, and you made a vow to me, and I've been with you. That's what the Lord is saying. And he's recounting this story. So this is actually really important. So now get up and leave the land, right? So we can end there. It's 9:50. So, yeah. Anybody want to close us off in prayer?
Okay. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for your promises. We thank you that we see your faithfulness through your word. We know that you are with us and not against us. So we just ask, Lord, that you would bring that to our remembrance. What we've learned, let it be deep within us. Bless our Shabbat service today. Let your presence and your faithfulness be made known and manifest in our midst. And I just thank